Good afternoon. Thanks for coming out. And we're back at Jackman Hall, where we have not been in quite a while. In fact, we were at Jackman Hall once the week after 9/11. Do you remember that? Because Sarah was here. And I think maybe a happier mood today. But frankly, I'm surprised. Who would have guessed anyone would come out for a panel on art writing? In past years, these panels have been a way for us, and by us I mean Canadian art, to introduce artists and their work, a circumvention of art writing, if you will. But given that it's our 30th anniversary, and that Canadian Art and the Canadian Art Foundation have been busy since day one with the development of art writing in Canada, the thought this year was to turn it over to some of the standout writers in our midst and to let them speak to their practice so that we can track some of the changes to the field over the past years. It's a new landscape out there with digital and social media. And in fact, today we are attempting our first ever webcasting of an event. And Leah Sandals promises me that we will have some questions from Halifax via Twitter later. We can hardly wait. But let's go back to when art writing was only a world of print. This takes me back to art school, way back to art school at OCAD in 1970. The momentous event of my first year was when a fellow tenant in my rooming house on Spadina knocked on my door one night and offered me a box of art magazines. He was moving, and enough was enough with a heavy, crumpled cardboard box. John was a draft dodger from Pennsylvania. From periodic conversations in our shared kitchen on the second floor of the rooming house, I knew that he had studied at the University of Rochester with the social philosopher Norman O. Brown, who in the 1960s was almost as famous as Marshall McLuhan. Brown ran a history of consciousness program, and it had brought John sideways to an energetic new magazine called Artforum that had started in California and then packed up for New York at the end of the decade. Inside the box, John was offering me that night were the issues he had collected. They were issues with feature stories by the likes of Donald Judd, Robert Morris, Robert Smithson, artist contributors who brought insider entree to what was then a radical new art. Reading 4,000 words by Robert Morris could take a week, but you came out of it with a budding knowledge of phenomenology, ontology, and French adventures in theory. Reading Robert Smithson, on the other hand, was an inventive immersion in the creative utopianism of conceptual art, while Donald Judd was a bracing confrontation with someone at home with certainty, the certainty that good art had an agenda, and that artists were the ones who knew best about what other artists were doing. This lineup sure beat classes in costume drawing and 3D design at school on McCall Street. In fact, Artforum became its own school for me. Many a night was spent poring over the stories and images in those heavy, shiny, square miracles of information. I carted them about to other rooming houses over the next few years, adding to the load with my own copies. My attachment to art magazines started there. So did a disposition to trust the artist in any orienteering to art. Art writing proper, the preserve of art critics, was something of another world, more like the shadows in Plato's cave from the fire that was art outside. Give me painter Manny Farber writing on film than any film critic. Farber, whose reviews sometimes appeared at the back of the book in Artforum, wrote about what it was like to actually see a film, in prose that matched the jump cuts on the screen. He would get lost in actors' facial features and the elegances of cinematography before narratives and storylines. For me, the attention to visuality became what I looked for in any writing about visual arts. This is probably why I kept up with Robert Hughes in Time magazine for decades, not only because it seemed instructive to read about art in the midst of surrounding news, economic, and culture coverage, but because Hughes, in spite of a tendency to sweeping statement, often wrong-headed statement in terms of contemporary art practice, nonetheless had access to a kind of magic that when he liked the art, could find an exact prose parallel of what made the art hum in the act of perception. When he didn't like the art, the result was often a prose cartoon. Reading Hughes at his best, on the other hand, was to make discoveries on how to see. His column in Time was a bi-weekly education in looking. This prejudice for visual engagement only deepened when one day in the early 1980s, I had started writing myself, I picked up John Berger's About Looking on a bookshelf at the world's biggest bookstore. I thought Berger's earlier ways of seeing was polemically pedantic, although I loved the paisley shirt he wore throughout the original television series. I thought The Success and Failure of Picasso equally miscued, but About Looking was different. Not only did it have a Gary Winogrand Zoo photo on its cover, it presented a collection of essays that fused the act of looking with the creation of meaning, looking as a form of activist thinking. How could you not love a book with an essay that began by asking two questions, an absolute rhetorical faux pas in the journalism school I had gone to? But here was Berger wondering, first, what did August Sander tell his sitters before he took their pictures? And second, how did he say it so that they all believed him in the same way? Berger wanted to know because he noticed that all of them, the hundreds upon hundreds of sitters in Sander's photographs, all look at the camera in the same way. The look towards the lens is Sander's style. The look defines an era, a culture. It's a sharing, a communion, but it's also a confinement and a harbinger of a tragic conformity that played out in the decades that follow. In his essay, Berger takes a simple visual fact into the realm of profound cultural and historical reflection. And of course, this is the promise implicit in paying attention when we look. It's what's at stake in art and visuality. Another essay in that book had particular import and seemed central, I think, to some of the key issues in the practice of art writing. It was Secker and the Forest, and it remains a tour de force about when looking shows us something that seems off or wrong or inept. In it, Berger writes about being haunted by a painting by the 19th century Turkish painter Secker Ahmet Pasa, who had studied in Paris with some of the Barbizon school and then returned to Istanbul to introduce what Berger calls a European optic to Turkish art. By European optic, he's referring to linear perspective, and he's confounded in the painting by a single tree in a painting called Woodcutter in the Forest that doesn't conform to diminishing scale, that looks wrong and outsized compared to the rest of the painting. What haunts Berger is that the wrongness somehow seems right. It has its own special eloquence. Ahmet is breaking the rules. He wants his woodcutter to be optically overwhelmed by the tree, just as in real life he would be overwhelmed by the forest. The painter is not painting a scene. He's representing something existential. He wants to show the woodcutter not only entering, but also within the forest, a double reality, a foreshortening of narrative, if you will. At first, Berger regards this as a gap in tradition, a fissure between the cultures of East and West. But a month later, so he tells us one paragraph down, He's back in Germany reading Heidegger. And he comes across, turns the page slowly, comes across the phrase, the nearness of distance, which is a description of how the horizon can seem to approach us, of, in fact, how the world comes to us as we, like the woodcutter, go towards it. If I treasure this essay, it's because it also encapsulates a not unknown experience for an art writer, this one at least. The experience of looking at art and feeling confounded, yet possessed, and open to deferring judgment while coming to terms with being disconcerted. Berger's Wrong Tree speaks to the dangers of rushing to judgment in looking at art, in rushing to judgment in looking at anything, in fact. Art writing for me has always seemed most engaging when it negotiates this kind of subtle disorientation. If I think about what keeps me writing about art and enabling others to write about art, it's this opportunity to discover the meanders of something that's in plain view. The situation is complex and rich and interwoven, and art writing helps us know it intimately. That's why I'm here, or maybe I should say still here. And part of the pleasure of the job is in finding colleagues, people who also make careers or part careers coming to terms with art. And this is who I have with me today, colleagues. Colleagues who can open this conversation further with their own experience. They are Sarah Milroy, the former editor and publisher of Canadian Art, who from 2001 to 2010 served as the staff art critic for the Globe and Mail, where she now continues as an art columnist. Over the years, Sarah has contributed essays to exhibition catalogs on the work of Gappy Full, Greg Cournot, Jack Chambers, Fred Herzog, and others. She is a contributor to Border Crossings and The Walrus, and writes regularly for Canadian Art. Beginning November 1, her exhibition From the Forest to the Sea, Emily Carr in British Columbia, co-curated with Ian Desjardins, begins its run at the Dulwich Picture Gallery in London. So for those of you lucky to stay on from Freeze, wait for 2 weeks and go to the Dulwich. Also with me is Gabrielle Moser, a name I hardly ever use, the writer, educator, and independent curator who regularly contributes from Toronto to artforum.com. Gabby, that's the person I know. Gabby holds a PhD in art history and visual culture from York University and teaches at OCAD University, in fact. Yeah, right. Her writing has appeared in Art News, Fillip, In Paradox of Photography and Culture, and Canadian Art. She's curated exhibitions for Access Gallery, Gallery TPW, X-Space, and Vitae. She's also organizing the main exhibition for the 2015 Pan Am Games. And with us too is Skye Goodden, the founding editor of a new online art publication titled Nomos, after the Greek god for writers and poets, and other things too, I think. Yeah. Launching next month, it is a site for international art writing and journalism. We've all known Skye as the executive editor of Blouin Artinfo Canada from 2011 to 2014. She holds an MFA in criticism and curatorial practice from OCAD University and writes regularly for Modern Painters, Art and Auction, Canadian Art, Sea Magazine, and others. Sarah will go first today, then Gabby, then Skye. After that, we'll roundtable for a bit and then take questions. So, Halifax, get ready. Sarah.
Okay, thank you, Rick. Wonderful thoughts, and I think we'll discover as I go through my remarks here that we're in great accord on a number of key issues that you raised. But so what's going to follow is a bit of a memoir and I suppose a bit of a manifesto as well. I want to start by saying it took me a long time to become an art critic. My first pieces were exploratory forays in my 20s for the Canadian Forum, a venerable left-wing journal of culture and politics that ran from 1920 up until 2000, when it sadly closed its doors. And my first piece was about a retrospective show of paintings by the social realist painter Parasceva Clark. It was an exhibition encountered by chance in the basement of the Dalhousie Art Gallery in Halifax in 1982. I think I was looking for a bathroom, and instead I found my destiny. I had just finished a graduate degree in English at Cambridge, and my husband and I were wintering over in Halifax. In that gallery, as I looked at the paintings, I discovered a kind of compulsion to record my experience of the work which flew in the face of everything that I understood about Canadian art at the time, with its preoccupation with landscape. Fortunately for me, Karen Mulholland, who was the editor then at Canadian Forum, said yes. My next piece after I moved to Toronto was about the Mystic North, Roald Nascard's marvelous exhibition about Canadian and Scandinavian art, which took place right here at the AGO. I can vividly remember running down the stairwell to the payphones that were below the entrance to the gallery, which was then a kind of dungeon-like configuration on Dundas Street, and phoning Karen Mulholland and saying, "Is anyone writing about the Mystic North? And has anyone, claimed that as their turf?" And she said, "No, no one's even called us about it. Like, nobody cares." I was like, "Can I write about it?" Anyway, she said yes, and then they ran it on the cover, which was wonderful for me at that time because I was just in my 20s. And it made it somewhat easier for me to approach Susan Walker, who was then assembling her startup team for Canadian art in 1984. And I went in to see her, and when a mouse ran over my foot in the interview, it was a mouse-infested building down on Front Street, I think she felt she had to hire me as a kind of payback. So that was fortuitous for me. And during those early years at Canadian Art, I was not a writer, I was an editor. And for many years, I was working closely with the best, Robert Enright, Adele Friedman, Nancy Towsley, Jay Scott, John Bentley Mays, Scott Watson, Gary Michael Dalt, to name some. And in the years later, when I was running Canadian Art, Richard Rhodes, the novelist Catherine Gauvier, Georges Bogardy from Montreal, Gillian McKay, and so many other wonderful voices. I learned from them, and I watched carefully how they structured their narratives, how they set up their leads, how they came to their conclusions, but I also learned from exploring in conversation what it was they were trying to say. And particularly with writers of a more scholarly bent, there was sometimes a gap, and often it was simply a matter of them not saying what they thought was so obvious that it didn't need saying. And I had to sometimes say it does need saying, because not everyone is where you are. So I was a reader, a first reader, and not a writer in those years, and the experience would go on to inform my writing. Mostly it made me humble. Notwithstanding my opening efforts at the Canadian Forum, I didn't really start being a writer until 1996, when I was almost 40. It was a profile of Dennis Reed that finally got me out of my shell, examining the intentions behind his rehang of the AGO's 19th century collection, which is still pretty much intact in that red room that's where the paintings are skied. And it's still one of my favorite rooms, and Dennis is still one of my favorite people. And all around me during those years, things were changing. Academic discourse on art was sort of hiving itself off from an emerging phenomenon that I would call vernacular art criticism. Writing that felt more like a conversation with the reader, a disclosure of experience, than like a defense before a firing squad, which academic writing actually needs to be. I can remember coming across a book that is now long forgotten, Blimey, From Bohemia to Britpop, The London Art World from Francis Bacon to Damien Hirst by Matthew Collins in 1997. I was overcome. I thought, I can't believe that this man is actually reporting something he overheard at a party, and then including a random association that he made while attending an exhibition or sitting in the lunchroom. Anything that was in his head was suddenly fair game for inclusion, and there were many writers exploring this kind of writing at that time. By then, I was starting to write for the Globe and Mail, and I was reading the work of my colleagues voraciously as well. Writers like Collins were blowing up the silos between discourses, letting in the light of lived experience and of thinking as it unfolds. The thing was, though, that Collins could talk about Velázquez or William Blake or Wittgenstein with equal ease. He was just of the inclination to be personable about it. For all his casualness of tone, for all his occasional flares of wicked humor, he knew his stuff. He'd found a way to travel and to look. He had read deeply and broadly. He had something called expertise, a concept that now seems to be a bit up for grabs. So, expertise, how do we define it? Does expertise mean having all the answers? I think rather expertise means being able to frame the questions. Expertise allows us in an informed way to curate the experience that the reader will have of the work, to share the context that is in your head, a context that comes from reading and looking over many years, to put one choice idea, one quotation, one reference beside another, and set the work of art within it, and to share the privileges that come with having found a way to have a life of reading and looking with readers who may not have had that opportunity. It also allows us to direct the attention of the public where it can most profitably be spent, and to share our tools of thought. At its heart, I think good art criticism is generous in this way. When I was younger, my understanding of criticism was, I think, coarser. Mass media encouraged writers, particularly newspaper writers, to record a verdict, thumbs up or thumbs down. Were you for it or against it? The 10 hottest artists syndrome, I call it. This imperative would numb the authenticity of any writer. The fact of the matter is, I'm a natural doubter, given to introspection and self-scrutiny. I look at things slowly. The temptation was to suppress that quality of mind in the interest of being swift and authoritative. Instead, at the Globe and Mail, where I'd become staff critic, I started to think instead of myself as a maker alongside the artist. If you're writing for a national vehicle like a magazine or a newspaper, you have to accept that most readers will never see the exhibition you're writing about. Rather, they will have an experience of that exhibition reconstituted through your imagination and language. When I started realizing that I was actually making my own exhibition in their heads through my words, art criticism started to feel like a whole other kind of adventure. That through the powers of my description, if I did it right, I might even be able to induce a kind of somatic experience of the work that was completely liberated from the physical. With that shift came another idea. Rather than aiming to make assertions, why not write out of a more authentic place of uncertainty and let the readers travel with me through that, through the to and fro of my thinking? And why not bring the artist to them directly where possible through quotation and let the reader do some of their own thinking alongside me? It seemed to me that this would be a more dynamic way to read. It seemed to me, too, that it would be a less boring way to write. But this, too, make no mistake, requires expertise and critical judgment. Who to cover and when. Which can go deeper into the circumstances in question, a review or a profile. If it's a profile, which anecdote to disclose, which biographical detail to select as relevant, which works to focus on in a body of work, how to create that thread of meaning between works, which detail of the studio to select for the record. And remember, when you're writing, particularly when you're writing for print, you're always in the process of creating the historical record. Which quotations to use and when in the interview process to push the artist for a firmer statement. Which historical antecedents are to be called to mind, and is the artist always the best guide to that? These are all critical judgments. They require expertise, although it is an expertise that might be more transparent to the reader, at least if you're doing it right. So I sort of redefined my ambitions, and I set sail again, and I'm still working on it. But every once in a while, I come across something that is really inspiring, something that throws a few new logs on my fire. A few weeks ago, reading on a late summer afternoon at a friend of mine's cabin, I came across a little passage in Rebecca Solnit's book of collected essays, Men Explain Things to Me. Now, ladies and gents, if you have just a little digression here along feminist lines, you've not read that essay and book, you really must do so. But it was in Solnit's brilliant essay, Woolf's Darkness, Embracing the Inexplicable, that I had my revelation. There, Solnit describes the allure to her of Virginia Woolf as a thinker and Woolf's sophisticated cultivation of doubt. But she digresses into a discussion of the role of art criticism, and it is so perfect that it deserves the 2 minutes of attention that I'm hoping that you will give it. Here goes. Solnit writes, during my years as an art critic, I used to joke that museums love artists the way that taxidermists love deer. And something of that desire to secure, to stabilize, to render certain and definite the open-ended, nebulous, and adventurous work of artists is present in many who work in that confinement, sometimes called the art world. A similar kind of aggression against the slipperiness of the work and the ambiguities of the artist's intent and meaning often exists in literary criticism and academic scholarship, a desire to make certain what is uncertain, to know what is unknowable, to turn, I love this phrase, to turn the flight across the sky into the roast upon the plate, to classify and contain. What escapes classification can escape detection altogether. There is a kind of counter-criticism, though, that seeks to expand the work of art by connecting it, opening up its meanings, inviting in the possibilities. A great work of criticism, Solnit concludes, can liberate a work of art to be seen fully, to remain alive, to engage in a conversation that will not end, but instead will keep feeding the imagination, not against interpretation, but against confinement, against the killing of the spirit. Such criticism is itself great art. This is the kind of criticism that seeks not to pit the critic against the text, does not seek authority. It seeks instead to travel with the work and its ideas, to invite it to blossom and invite others in the conversation that might previously seemed impenetrable, to draw out relationships that might have been unseen and open doors that might have been locked. This is the very kind of criticism that respects the essential mystery of a work of art, which is in part its beauty and its pleasure, both of which are irreducible and subjective. The worst criticism seeks to have the last word and leave the rest to us in silence. The best opens up an exchange that need never end. I put the book down and I thought, that's it. That's it exactly. Thank you.
Gabby.
I'm noticing already that there's a lot of resonances actually across, the three and some of the things I had planned to say, and a few divergences, I think. I come from a slightly different background in that I have an academic background. I have a PhD. I spend most of my time teaching over at OCAD, and maybe that does inform some of the ways I approach art writing. But I'm going to read from the notes that I brought to begin with. So, as someone who is almost the exact age as Canadian art, it is daunting to be asked to reflect on the past 30 years of art writing, since that for me would be an entire lifetime of trying to write about art. So I want to take a more focused approach and think today about two questions that I find myself coming back to whenever I think about why I write or why we all write, and that I think is important to keep in mind if we are considering this question of art criticism's past and future. And the first is, why do we write about art? And the second is, who are we talking to when we write about art? So when Rick first invited me to speak on the panel, he posed a question for me to think about, which was what makes us sit down to write about art, not the first time we write an exhibition review, which is something that many of us do, either for a school assignment or a first attempt at getting published. But what compels some of us to sit down to write the 10th or 20th, or in my case, 49th review, as I'll be doing next week? And I thought that was an interesting way to think about it, was not in terms of what inspires us to try to write about art in the first place, but what, in my case, feels like a compulsion to keep doing something that most people will admit is a torturous task. So how is it that I find myself working, or at the very least identifying as an art writer, when that was certainly not the career I thought I was setting out on when I wrote my very first exhibition review, which was more than 10 years ago? And it's definitely not for the money. So for this 1.5 hour conversation, for instance, I'm receiving an honorarium that is 4 times the fee I get paid for a review at artforum.com, a job that can take anywhere from 4 to 12 hours of work, depending on what I'm writing about and how many rounds of edits that requires. And so for those keeping score at home, that's $50 a review. So, if anyone in the audience is considering a career as an art writer, I'd suggest looking into the viability of public speaking instead, because that's where the money is. So it's not for the money, obviously, that I sit down to write, but what often compels me to write is this nagging, sometimes obsessive feeling that an artwork is doing something, and that to get closer to what that something is requires words, written words. And in those moments of near obsession, it feels like my task as a writer is to do justice to the work and to the experience it prompted for me as a viewer. And it's close, I think, to what Lucy Lepard has described as an act of translation, an attempt to communicate the sensory aspects of an artwork, the sound, the smell, the physical encounter with it, through text. And descriptions of artworks are really important to me. I think they're a vital function of art writing. Often just in wrestling with how to describe a work, I realize what it is about the piece that has fascinated or troubled me. How a writer describes an artwork also tells us volumes about their experience of it and their judgment of it. There's a politics to description, and I think we sometimes forget this aspect of art writing when we focus too much on our interpretation of it. And so I think often of a text that I wrote about Montreal artist John Raffman's 9 Eyes of Google Street View project as an instance of this, where I became sort of fixated on this series of work and constantly found myself going back to it. And by trying to articulate the kind of aesthetic that Google Street View has produced, this weird pixelated view of one another that we get, the process of just writing about that and trying to bring language to it opened up issues that have to do with technology's relationship to the history of photography and to our ethical obligations as viewers. But those thematic questions could only emerge through a description of what it is like to look at those images. And so for me, this is what, in many ways, distinguishes art writing from something like reportage or journalism. I expect art writing, and criticism in particular, to describe an artwork or an exhibition, to tell me something about the author's experience of that work, and to then offer an interpretation or a response or even a hypothesis about how that experience might be relevant to the bigger discussions that are happening in society. And I think this echoes things that both Rick and Sarah have said. The best art writing for me teaches me to see something that I hadn't noticed was there before. It shows me how to look differently. And I think there's less and less space for this kind of art writing in national and international arts publications these days. While I enjoy keeping up on art world gossip as much as anyone else, my friends might say perhaps more than most people, the kind of social reporting that now passes for arts coverage in many publications is not what I'm looking for when I read art criticism. I want something that actually, and I borrow here again from Lucy Lepard, increases and not decreases the distance between the artist and the viewer. So, the second question, who is it that we're talking to when we write about art? If I think back to that very first review I wrote at age 22, I was writing for a very limited audience, which was the contemporary Canadian art history class I was in at the University of British Columbia. And it was a school assignment, and I wrote about Marianne Nicholson's solo exhibition at ArtSpeak Artist Run Center. And when the course instructor handed back our graded assignment, she said she was going to read the 2 submissions that received the highest marks in the class, and mine was one of them. And as a type A pleaser, that, of course, was deeply satisfying. But I had no idea at the time that that was probably the only instance in my career as an art writer that I would receive such direct and immediate feedback on a review that I wrote. It's really, that was the only time. Yeah. I didn't know that I should have taken more joy in it. It was an unrealistic introduction to the kind of public response art writing usually elicits. Instead, it often feels like, and I heard Dan Fox, who's an editor at Frieze magazine, say this recently, that you write, you publish, and then silence, tumbleweeds. And that silence doesn't mean that people aren't reading art writing and art criticism, but there is often a delay between the moment of writing about art and the reception to or response to that text. And sometimes I think that's actually our fault as writers. I think that there is a need to write as though there is something at stake in our work. That art writing, like the exhibitions and artworks we write about, really do matter. And so although I feel committed to this public function of art writing and art criticism, I don't want to assume that I can know the audience that I'm writing for. Most often when I sit down to write, I think I'm actually writing for myself first. I sit to work through a set of ideas I have and to make sense of why an artwork or exhibition has stuck with me. And this is something I tell students whenever I teach art writing at OCAD, that writing for oneself is a really important function of art writing, and it's something we should all be doing more of. So when I sit down to write my 49th exhibition review next week, it will, as it usually does, feel indulgent. It feels like an opportunity to slow down my process of looking and to think seriously about how an artwork or exhibition has altered the way that I look at the world. One of the biggest changes in art writing, and I think problems facing art writers today, is this problem of really not being able to make a living writing about art. I do it out of a somewhat nerdy obsession with the works I have seen and a neurotic compulsion to work through these ideas in language, but I also do it because I have privilege. I have a secure job. I have the advantage to be able to choose precarious labor and invest surplus energy into something that cannot sustain me financially. This is not true of many of the students that I work with, and I often wonder about the voices we're missing out on, the ways of looking at work that we don't get to see because of this problem of accessibility, of believing that something is at stake, and of compensating people for taking the time to show us how we might look differently.
Scott.
I haven't prepared something, but I have just come off a whistle-stop Canadian tour giving lectures talking about the work I've done, so I feel that I can speak from a place of confidence in perhaps a less formal way. I had an experience when I was just coming out of my master's in criticism at OCAD, where I was hired for a contract to, through the Justina Barnacky Gallery, to edit over 1,000 reviews that went back to the early 1960s through the, I'd say, early 1990s at the ccc.ca, terrible URL, archive, which is a profound resource, especially for Canadian students, Canadian art students, and students generally of art. It was an education that somehow I hadn't had yet. That on the ground, in the weeds experience of the words. I was reading recently that I think it was Hunter S. Thompson rewrote his favorite novels insofar as, word for word, to know what it had felt like to write those words. And here I was given the opportunity, although sort of with limitations in terms of how much I could change. Of course, it was a very superficial edit that I was treating these texts with, but I was living inside the words. So 1,000 reviews later, I had a distinct sort of knowledge and some frustration about what I had seen in that 30-year, more or less, period of art writing in Canada and what I was experiencing in the contemporary moment at that point around 2010. And looking around, I thought there are some diminishments that have occurred in Canadian art criticism and that I would like to address. Very felicitously, at the end of that contract, knowing not at all what I was going to do after, I had a phone call from a critic I admired in New York, Ben Ginocchio, who was helming Artinfo, its international franchise, and Art and Auction magazine. And he said, would you like a job, more or less, to address the Canadian art world for Artinfo? And I said, yes, please. And what it was an opportunity, basically, because that was about the only phone call we would have for the next 3 years. I was lucky enough to experience benign neglect from that office and really do what I felt needed to be done in terms of change the conversation in the ways that I could with a staff of writers, but myself as well, proliferating vast amounts of text per week. And so what I looked to do was, first of all, address what I thought was a lack of evaluative criticism in the field, what I had seen there to be in that period between the 60s and early 1990s, where critics were in a discourse with one another, but not to the exclusion of an attentive and intelligent audience, which was always assumed. Moreover, taking unpopular positions from time to time to address what isn't working. And I don't, of course, mean young emerging artists taking their first stab. I mean institutions that are promulgating bad programming or favoring poorly intended efforts, or et cetera. The government, the bureaucracies, the administrations that are at play, but yes, also the trends emerging and the threads that we see that for both good and bad need to be addressed and engaged. So I wanted to sort of retake that that mantle and issue, direct my writers in such a way that we could continue a discourse that was, and this is the second point I wanted to sort of touch on, in addition to being critical, accessible. And I thought that was an important feature that I wasn't seeing as well, but this less so in the Canadian art world and more in the international conversation. Rick was gesturing to Artforum, and I've been reading about Artforum's history, and through the words of a former colleague of mine, actually, who's writing I admire very much, Ben Davis. And he was sort of, summarizing Artforum's history in a sort of concise and very clear way for a book he recently published called 9.5 Theses on Art and Class, and talking about its history in light of what he rightly put in quotations, the crisis in criticism, one that only critics could acknowledge amongst themselves and couldn't agree on the source of. At any rate, he was looking at how the obfuscating language that was in fashion in art writing through particularly the 1990s, where French theory was inflecting the conversation in ways that formed a clubhouse, a kind of white-walled conversation where very few were admitted. That was part of what he perceived to be recent diminishment in authority. I can acknowledge that in general, I think we are all sort of frustrated with the academic pretense that has shouldered into art writing, and that at this point, I'm really thrilled to see, especially in online forums such as Artinfo, but there are many others that we'd be familiar with as a group here today, that kind of language is being shooken out. And we are impatient for a conversation that addresses the subject in the room, the personal experience, the more vernacular experience, like you, Matthew Collins, also a colleague, and and gets back to a kind of clarity that admits vulnerability. So those were my ambitions with Artinfo, and I think that I achieved quite a few of them, at least in certain articles that were taken up with great favor by not just my colleagues, but by people I couldn't have assumed or known were reading. And that felt like a success for me. I'm now moving on from Artinfo and pushing some of these same agendas forward with this publication that I'm launching next month. And in this case, I'm going to reach further than the Canadian border and address the international conversation, but with similar sort of mantles of criticality and accessibility in the tones that we carry. So I suppose that's where those are the things I hold dear, and this is my experience so far.
So do we have any questions for one another before we open things to the audience and the floor?
Well, I just want to, I really like your discussion of, the need for evaluative criticism. And I just wanted to, clarify that in talking about extending the work of artists, I think there's many ways of exerting an evaluation, such as paying attention to something, and that I know that when I started into writing about art in the 1980s, there was a notion that only the exhibition review could be really truly evaluative in that way, that there was only one way to be critical. And I guess part of what I've come to believe over time is that those evaluative activities, or functions can actually be embedded in other kinds of formats of writing. But I'm very sensitive to what you're saying, and I think one of the things I feel for younger critics coming along is that, like when I started into the field in the early 80s, there were probably a dozen full-time staff critics on newspapers across the country. sometimes several at one newspaper, like particularly in Quebec. And now I think there's maybe 3 in the country. I mean, there's been this astonishing attrition in terms of opportunity for critical writing that's specialized. It's the distinction between criticism and coverage, I think, is a really important one. And I think one of the reasons that you see writers taking less risks in terms of being evaluative is that they are vulnerable financially, whereas if you're paid to think by a newspaper, your livelihood is secured, you have a salary. So it tends to produce a more robust, flavorful, more dynamic voice because the person is being protected institutionally. And I lament that our younger critics that are emerging do not have that assurance that we enjoyed.
That was something that I was privileged to have at Artinfo, a salary. And I hear what you're saying. Just recently, when I was giving a lecture and moderating a panel similar to this one in Vancouver, we can say, even of Calgary, that we do.
Right.
And the audience was highly educated and engaged, much as I expected them to be, and was also frustrated. One of the major threads that came through in their response, though, was, well, we all wear about 3 hats. It's a very small community, and we're artists, curators, and writers all at the same time. So to take a risk and say something challenging or in any way sort of vulnerable making would endanger our livelihood. And I just thought,
to alienate someone who is a potential colleague, because I think all of us feel, when we're evaluating our colleagues' work, that there's things about that colleague we deeply admire, and sometimes they do things that we have questions with, but overall, you don't want to sink their ship, so, and everyone's working together, and it's a small community, particularly in somewhere like, like Vancouver or Calgary, so people naturally drift away from direct confrontation, I feel, unless they're salaried to be forthright.
Right. I think it risks the greater health of the system, though, that we are putting in print sometimes what doesn't work. And I know that in Canada, we consider ourselves a small community, but it's one that will continue to be small unless we start sort of showing braver faces with regards to what troubles or diminishes what's working.
Exactly.
I think there's also this question of writing as though there's something at stake in writing, because I think what I often see is something, an exhibition is put on or an artist's new body of work comes out and the response is silence because there's sort of not, there isn't something there to engage.
Description alone.
Right, and I think that's much worse than having someone critically engage. That to me is a sign of respect that you've taken the project very seriously or the artwork very seriously enough to write this well thought out and critical analysis of it. To me, that's actually, the best sort of function of art criticism or art writing, that someone has taken seriously what another person has produced.
I think it's, the problem's also structural, in the sense that there is a lot more art than there used to be, and that, in fact, despite the proliferation of art programs within academia, there's been a kind of loss of discourse. Discourse moved from art to theory in the 1970s and 80s. And that since then, in the 90s, we've had this incredible proliferation of art within the art scene. And I'm not sure there is a reigning discourse that would help clarify that kind of evaluation in the way that Don Judd could write and just tick off the points as to why
nail
something,
the moment.
Why something was good or not good, et cetera, et cetera. I think that may be a general cultural problem. I think the culture itself has probably lost contact with all kinds of discourses that had developed earlier and created the models for critics like Clement Greenberg or Hilton Kramer or whoever to sit up at the top of the heap and offer. In fact, much of the 80s, criticism seemed like a kind of police action in terms of what worked and what didn't work. Personally, I've always had a low opinion of opinion. so subjective. And I go back to what I always noted about Robert Hughes, is that when he did not like the art and expressed that dislike, he wrote cartoons. Mm-hmm. When he liked something, he wrote something more valuable. And so for me, that's always been a kind of guideline. And
maybe that was a record of his inability to see the complexity of the thing that he disliked. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe that's a record of his refusal to engage.
That's what I mean. That opinion came in to outweigh any other experience in
allowing himself to have that experience of the thing that gave him discomfort. Yeah.
So, I mean, we all know that's the crisis, right? The crisis is a lack of orientation to any given discourse about art and art writing. Mm-hmm. I mean, you go to Venice and, Weisskircher does an amazing Venice Biennale, but it's a classical Biennale. That makes, Robert Storr's earlier Biennale seem a bit pathetic and institutional. Mm-hmm. And then, Massimiliano Gioni comes up and does his encyclopedic Biennale, and it's truly remarkable and seems light years away from what Kruger had done 2 years before. So, every 2 years the model changes, and in between Documenta's there, and that sets new standards. But there's with the absence of a kind of evolving contemporary canon, which in fact we've not had since the 1980s, it's very difficult for criticism to forge that kind of push forward that historically it used to have.
I think I would disagree. First of all, I would reference a sort of exciting moment, to go back to Artforum, that happened in reference to the Venice Biennale, where Robert Storr had directed it. And then the backlash in the letters to the editor section of Artforum was such that he felt, this is Storr who likes a good fight, but compelled to respond. And then other critics and curators sort of came to his defense or perpetuated that, what became, a very involved back and forth over the course of, I think, a year of Artforum issues being published. Now that was, maybe on the level of a little salacious. It maybe didn't advance a bigger discourse than so many egos. But at least it felt like an engagement where people were sitting above the issues and showing some integrity for them, showing, well, to return to this perfect term, where the stakes were for them. The other thing that I would gesture to is that we don't have a sort of a dominant argument being made or discourse happening about contemporary art, and that's so much for the better. What we see, for instance, within my staff at Artinfo, I saw, one of my writers, Joseph Henry, show that, emerge as a strong writer within a couple genres and discourses in particular. One of his wheelhouses was net art, and his audience was growing and his confidence was growing, and so I said, continue, push forward. Then suddenly you see him having a conversation with Patty Johnson, maybe not directly, who's also, a prominent New York writer at this point, editing Art F City, but that became, you saw that they were, in effect, however indirectly, speaking to one another. So then you have a writer like Ben Davis who gets right above all of those sort of annexes and niches, however subtle or profound, and this is what makes him a great critic for our generation, the ability to be at the 30,000-foot mark, looking at the topography of the contemporary scene and saying, those are the spikes and those are the valleys. I do think that it's possible, and we do see critics stand up to that level. Peter Sheldon at New Yorker has always been good for this as well. I think it's just that there isn't one discourse being largely directed by white men like Don Judd, but so many voices. And it takes a great critic to be able to hear the chorus and find the lead vocalist.
I think also there's something, if there isn't a kind of uber narrative at work that we're responding to as there was in the day of Judd, there is an ongoing way, I think, in which critics and artists are in cahoots on the same side, which is, cultivating and encouraging a kind of subjectivity, which is in itself, it seems to me, a kind of political act to encourage people to slow down and really experience their own inner life in relation to whatever it is that the object provokes. Makes you feel your own singularity and the kind of refines your perception of yourself. And, you know, in that regard, I think there's something very resistant about art criticism as there is about art making.
Mm-hmm. By focusing on that subject.
Yeah, by insisting on that subjectivity. I remember once a wonderful essay that Adam Gopnik wrote in the New Yorker probably about 15 years ago, saying that all art is political art because it encourages you to think of yourself as a subjective individual, and that, you know, the forces in society are always trying to make us into the herd. And the work of the artist in arousing these kinds of experiences and sensations encourages us to understand ourselves as an independent subjectivity. And I think that good criticism, you know, encourages that in the art viewer, mm-hmm. and allies itself with the work of the artist as well in terms of how they function in society.
Right.
But then do you think about your work in that way as well?
Right. Well, I just begin to wonder how then the art critic is different from a Yelp reviewer, right? Like this mm-hmm. is the insistence of like online review databases, is that each person who writes a review has this subjective viewpoint that is somehow unique mm-hmm. and is going to give you the confidence to choose the right restaurant or whatever it is that you're looking for. So then, the question becomes, how do you distinguish which voices are the ones that you trust from 30,000 feet, or which are the people that are just annoyed because they waited 40 minutes for their table at the restaurant? I mean, Brian Drucker, who writes for Rhizome, has been writing gallery reviews on Yelp, which I actually think are fantastic, that often describe the atmosphere of commercial galleries in Chelsea. But and I think he's playing at that tension, is like we don't have this expertise necessarily to rely on anymore for our, not our authority, but our position to speak from as art critics. So then how do we operate in this new context where, yes, theoretically everyone is actually a restaurant critic or an art critic or a literary critic?
Because that priority and preeminence is no longer being conferred necessarily by major media platforms.
Right, well, quite literally.
Who's giving
money.
You authority?
Yeah.
You have to craft it for yourself.
Right.
Well, it's a democratic moment, and thank goodness, because we were just getting to a breaking point, I think, with our contemporary institutions feeling too exclusive and impregnable. And suddenly we see forums emerging online where an opinion is welcome and more than possible. And yeah, the Yelp review that method that you just mentioned is a sort of comic example of that, but perfectly critical and sharp in the frame that it's taking. I just wonder, when we talk about authority, that was one thing that I picked up from you, Sarah, and I wonder after that, why would we defer authority or look not to have it in the voice that we issue, the voice that needn't remind one of our subjectivity, but simply speak from it?
Well, what I meant to be saying was that I feel that we want to, I mean, you're following the voice because you do find it authoritative, you do find it trustworthy. But I think that anything where a situation in which you can arouse people to start to want to develop their own sense of an independent mastery of the subject at hand is also very vigorous writing. You know, like it's like you don't want to be in a situation where you're saying, my big nightmare every year at the Globe and Mail was always like, they would want like 10 artists that are the best. That kind of, that sort of really coarse type of newspaper idea. Nothing against them. Every newspaper in the world does it. Or even more harrowing, 10 worst shows of 2007, and you just go, oh my God, if I was going to criticize a show, I'd like to be able to have the space to do it in an intelligent way, That's the kind of authoritativeness that I think is very shallow and unproductive, but in terms of wanting to maintain one's authority of voice, I mean, that's, of course.
My experience at Artinfo is similar, where it was sort of subtly suggested and expected that lists would be made, which take a great deal of research and work for all of their reductive profiling.
Right.
And you're right, the shades of gray get lost and you can look idiotic.
Yes, indeed.
That being said, they are clickbait. They are heavily trafficked. They go viral. They can make careers. And in my experience, have helped a great deal, especially the 30 under 30 I've done for 2 years running. I do wonder after and worry about those models, but I also think if we want a greater readership, if we're inviting a greater sense of popularity within the hallowed halls of art criticism, then shouldn't we be embracing those opportunities and just trying to find a way to massage them to our will?
I know, I kept saying, can't I do, 10 artists that I'm thinking about this week? Is there some way to reformat this so that I don't have to, be giving the FDA certified seal of approval, like they're a slight slab of meat, But I understand what you're saying. These are career-making opportunities when you can just go Shazam, and it can be extremely powerful, and one doesn't want to recoil from being able to have that kind of influence. So, but it's torturous, as you say,
Well, and there has to be room, I think, for people to also, like, for critics to change their minds in public. Like some of the people
I love it when that happens.
that are my favorite people to read, like Adrienne Searle, will reverse a position on an artist's work and is very open about that. And I think that is a trap that we can fall into in thinking that we do have to pass judgment or give authority.
Or be for or against, as I was saying.
Right,
I suddenly realized, wouldn't it be more interesting if people could say, could understand how you go through an exhibition and you say, okay, I see this and this, how am I, what's the actual experience I'm having? Let's not give the finished, what I've come to in the end as my fixed position. Let's actually try and think out loud here so people can have the experience with you that you had in the space. It becomes a very challenging thing to accomplish, and not necessarily one I've mastered, but it's a challenge that interests me. Whereas the challenge of 10 not to miss is less interesting to me as I'm getting older.
I was just going to say something apropos lists. Again, way back in art school, we used to, in fact, I had a job in the library just to make sure I always got to see the first Artforum when it came in. We used to play an Artforum game. We'd go back 5 years and flip through the year to see, because indeed the cover of Artforum could make a career. There were very few publications back then that could make a career, but then Flash Art started making European careers, and then modern painters came around out of England, and a whole other series of careers got made through publications. But what was interesting with Artforum, and I'm sure applies to Flash Art and modern painters, et cetera, and Frieze, is that you go back 5 years and ask yourself, okay, this artist had the cover of Artforum. Are they still a player on the scene? And very few were. So many of these lists, so many of these opinions about what's successful or not successful have such a shallow lifespan.
The roots are so shallow.
And in the end, for me, that work doesn't have much to do with art criticism. There's a use for it. There's all kinds of opportunity. It's an exercise in power negotiation, which this culture is very, very, very concerned with. But in the end, does it tell us much about art? No. Maybe it does momentarily, but does it tell us anything that's worth holding on to? I have my doubts. And so I would much rather read something where an artist or a writer has taken an artist and the work they do seriously. Because, the other thing that's always left unsaid in any discussion about art writing is how much we depend on artists. If they did not do what they do, there is no us. So, I think we need to pay respect to that every time we open the laptop. Every time we press print, every time we do what we do, we need to remember where we sit in the scheme of things. And so, long lists about who's hot and who's not. I mean, I'd rather watch Netflix. In any event, I think it's time for some questions.
Yeah.
Do we have questions? Yes, sir.
I'm actually a critic myself. I criticize. I do critical reviews on music and film, and Hello? Hello?
That's good.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm actually a burgeoning critical writer. I do music and movies and all that stuff. And I'm fine. I want to move on from blogging, which is more of like my own free will and free publications, to getting my stuff published and paid and everything. So how would I go about emerging from a free freelance to like paid freelance?
Well, we should probably say lowly paid freelance.
Yeah.
It's hard to know. I mean, I'm an editor, and Sarah's been an editor. And the fact is, we tend to welcome people sending us emails or phone calls that say, hey, I'm interested in this. Are you interested in something from me? And then a conversation starts.
It's a good idea, too, to like look carefully at the venues that you're interested in, take time with them, read them, figure out what the flavor is, so that when you have a discussion with the editor, when you finally make contact, even if you have to like camp out outside their office or whatever, that you know the platform that you're asking for access to, and that's helpful too. Also, in terms of wasting your time, like you're going to know where you're going to feel more comfortable.
And sometimes little tricks, like mail it in letter form. Send it to the managing editor if it's a major publication where you know the editor-in-chief will be overwhelmed with similar submissions. Try to be distinctive, respectful, brief, concise. Have a position.
And I think often I tell students to say what it is that you are interested in about the artwork or the exhibition. Like, what is it you plan on saying? Like, what is the reason? Because the number of, I remember from working at Canadian Art, the number of pitches you get for every Art Gallery of Ontario show, power plant exhibition, Vancouver Art Gallery show is truly overwhelming, because those are the major institutions. But if you pitch something that is at a smaller space or that people might not have spent time with, that often also helps, and you have something interesting to say about it.
There's a little bit of spin on the ball, what you plan to do with it.
So, I mean, in summary, you need to know what you want to say, but you need to know where you're saying it. And you know, the hardest thing is to deal with a contributor who phones up very excited about what they want to write about, but not writing about it for us. Like, they have a different approach, a different writing style. So pay attention to where you want to place your writing, and assume they've made a whole series of decisions about producing writing that looks that way, and then try and match it. That's the easiest way to start. Yes? Is that Amy?
That's Amy. Fine.
Welcome.
Hi.
Amy Fung.
Yes, so I heard a lot of conflations and nuances between art criticism and the form of writing as a creative practice. And I was wondering if each of you could expand on that a little bit. Are they one and the same for you?
Between art criticism
And writing as a creative practice.
Yeah, I used to really avoid identifying as an art critic, because I felt like those were two different things, that there was criticism, that there's an art like critic role, and then there is sometimes this more creative, expansive writing. Like, I think about if I write a catalog essay or a feature article, as Sarah was saying, that there's maybe an evaluative function within it, but it's not always a critical function. Like, its point is not always to deconstruct. Yeah. So to me, they are actually separate things, but the way that this panel was sort of proposed was an art writing panel, so I was trying to think more broadly about those two things. But I certainly, when I sit down to write a review, write very differently than when I sit down to write a feature or a catalog essay, and I do take more liberties with probably proposing. Why do I do that? That's a good question. I think I assume partly that it's a different venue that I'm going to submit an exhibition review to than a catalog essay. I know it's a slightly different group of people that are reading those things for the most part. And just the word limit also. There's only so much that you can say in 450 words compared to 2,000.
Also, in a catalog essay, you're not really trying to arrest someone's attention in the middle of their busy day. You know, like you presume them to be committed, so that they're already engaged if they have the catalog, and presumably may have even seen the exhibition, which puts you in a whole different relationship.
I had a mentor whose words have sort of formed a stone pocket for me. He said, you know, at its best, good art criticism and art writing is equal to its object. And I like the elusiveness of that. What it means to me is on your best day, you're writing in a way that feels tonally similar, maybe, or at least aspires to be its own beautiful object. That being said, I've had to wean myself off or sort of discipline myself a bit from my tendencies as a younger writer to be Baroque. And I find that the strength in good criticism, the writers who I look to again and again, like Ben Davis, like Peter Sheldon, are not unnecessarily decorative for the sake of belles lettres, you know, type of writing. It can be a weakness. So right now, you know, as I continue to be very aware of my trajectory and my strengths and my weaknesses as a writer, that's the objective for me is how do you communicate a voice? How do you be as good as the object that you're addressing without unnecessary handicaps or propulsions of a kind of decorative order? That's where I'm at right now in terms of tone and voice. And that's a creative enterprise for me right now, is showing greater discipline in my writing.
Well, there's a whole history of tones of voice for art writing. You know, if you go back to the 19th century and read Ruskin or Walter Pater, there's a certain tone of voice that has disappeared entirely by the time Clement Greenberg gets a hold of it. Maybe not early Clement Greenberg, but the Clement Greenberg of the 1950s and 60s.
My question is, what do you as a group feel the responsibility of the critic is to provide the counter-narrative? That is to say, not the cranky negative review, but to challenge the kind of dominant narratives that are out there in the art world. And how often do you do that? Because I know well enough there are the responsibility of the critic to report on the big events that happen, but I think we do sometimes a disservice to curators, institutions, and artists if we don't say it like we see it. And if we don't like what we see and we don't write about it, then
Yeah. I mean, again,
why not?
I think that, you know, if you're a staff critic, I mean, that's one of the differences, I think, between freelance writers tend to write more about things that they're engaged by. Staff critics have to write about everything, whether they like it or not, because it's newsworthiness is the decider, you know, to borrow George Bush's parlance. You know, whether it's newsworthy, you may think the artist is not interesting at all, but it must be covered. And so you have to do, but I don't see a lot of people who are freelance necessarily seeking out to cover something that I think is uninteresting. I mean, I guess there's a distinction too between something being uninteresting and being bad in an interesting way. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't think there are many critics too that would seek out to write a scorching negative review of an emerging artist who's just not talented. Like, that's not relevant to anyone. Whereas if it's a negative review of someone who has a considerable reputation that has kind of developed along with spurious types of support around it, and then that becomes, to me, more interesting game. Mm.
I would add too that I think it's a bad idea to ever show your hand too clearly. So there have been writers, for instance, R.M. Vaughan, who was a staff writer for the Globe following your tenure there, whose agenda was too transparent for my taste, where he was going directly to the marginalia, to the underground, to the minority-inflected, you know, and such that he was never looking at the more obvious, as you're pointing out. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with him trying to sort of tip the balance and show greater favor for that kind of smaller, less likely to be profiled work. But when it's all you do, your agenda is actually eclipsing the value of your content. So I think balance is key, and to follow your nose, trust your instincts, more than have a political desire to address that which is not being addressed.
I feel like if you're writing in Canada, you're already writing the counter-narrative always, because we're so underrepresented generally. People forget that we're up here. But I think that often, I maybe feel that pressure sometimes, especially if I do decide to write about a popular exhibition that's had a lot of coverage or a lot of critical response. If there's something to me that's obvious that someone hasn't said yet or noticed that's at play, like I'm often a little bit second wave about these things, like a conspicuous lack of women that's in an exhibition, that I feel maybe someone should say something about that. That is something I might do, but it's not usually the impulse as a freelancer. It's usually this sense that I can't shake a work or an artist's practice and that I have to write about it in order to work through that. I do find myself doing it, if I write for somewhere like artforum.com, I do think about like covering a woman rather than a man and covering someone who's not white and European if I find that work interesting. So there's maybe a reparative gesture in what I choose to pay attention to that runs counter to the logic of mainstream art criticism, but I don't think that I necessarily go out to rebut whatever I've been reading so far.
And quite frankly, I think Richard's move was interesting. Richard R.M. Vaughan is a terrific writer, can write about anything, and important work, work that nobody knows, and for him to choose to use the Globe and Mail to write about exhibitions that not many people would otherwise attend to was a political move.
Yeah.
And I think very consciously a political move. And this is where art writing starts to assume a kind of meta value, because, and in fact, there's almost a predilection for us. The real crisis in art writing is this continuing need we all feel to confront the social circumstances for culture these days. Right. And I think that's what Richard was doing. I was happy to read it because I know I could always read something about the shows he wasn't writing about. But at the same time, to read about artists who we didn't know much about or didn't know their work or didn't even know where the galleries were, that in fact this was kind of a positive mood. And if only the Globe and Mail had 2 or 3 art critics, then in fact we'd be dealing with real culture. More questions? Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to come out in defense of Robert Hughes. Comment about him caricaturing what he did not like. And I agree he did do that, but, and I think this is quite apropos our conversation here, and kudos to all of you, by the way. It was terrific. Yeah, that when he does that, it's the punchline to a very detailed evisceration, as it were, like when he eviscerated the Corbusian nightmare that was Brasilia. That was like watching a Muhammad Ali fight. Yeah. That was like ballet. And later on, when he's cutting up Jeff Koons in The New Shock of the New, he actually gives him the floor, and Jeff Koons literally digs his own grave by saying that his stuff should be regarded in the same light as a Michelangelo. And then he pits it against Paul Arrigo. It's like absolute substance versus absolute surface. It's a no-brainer, I mean. So, but to me, where that comes from is that Robert Hughes had to use the vernacular balls. And also he
or
knew,
ovaries, as case may be.
Yes, but I mean that in the I mean that in the universal sense.
I know.
Let's call them the balls of wisdom or whatever. I don't know. But where that comes from is that he understood. Well, he was like he had the molecular structure of a rock. He was diffused through and through, immutable. He was who he was. And that's why we hate him, and that's why some people love him. But he knew one thing, and he knew that a critic has to stand for something and has to stand against something. And that's what's missing today. That's what's so sad about today, that people don't have the guts to do that. For whatever reason, I think we've all covered them today. But I just wanted to bring that up. It wasn't a question, I'm really sorry, and I didn't want to take up too much time. But I'm done now, but sorry.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Oh, I see Leah's hand, so let's find out how Halifax is doing.
I don't know if it's from Halifax, but yeah, we've had a lot of reaction on Twitter. Somebody in Winnipeg saying more critical writing is needed, last reportage. But there was a question from a younger commenter here. How can emerging art writers move not only from, let's say, unpaid into paid art writing, but from freelance into something more permanent, like an editor role or something in the publication department with a gallery? So I guess it's a question around the precarity to a certain extent.
Sorry,
It's a question about the how do young writers move from freelancing into a permanent editorial role? Any advice?
I think
Twitter
it's
wants
just
to
simply, I mean, in a way, it's sort of the same response as we gave this gentleman who's the music and film critic. It's pay attention to the platforms, study them, figure out where your rightful habitat is, and present yourself in some inventive way. There's no, there is a constant search, I believe, for talent in art writing, as the same way there is a constant search for the talent in artists. And it's a hungry machine that needs new bodies, So work carefully on your craft, clarify your voice, read deeply, travel as much as you can and look, figure out what it is you stand for, and then make your arguments.
And with those full-time jobs, be prepared for the fact that you get to write maybe 30% of your time, and the other 70% of the time is administrative work that you might not want to be doing 70% of the time. I think that there's actually a big divide between really great art writers and people who are fantastic editors, because it takes a very different set of skills.
Yeah.
Right, so gear up to make synopses of gallery press releases.
Yeah.
That's exciting work.
It can
We all jump in.
It's good exercise. Asking for images from galleries relentlessly.
Anything else? Yes.
Yes.
Hi, Rick, and hi, everyone else. My name is Nora, and I worked for the Canadian Art Foundation, and before that, actually, I graduated from the Courtauld, so I'm sorry that criticality is in my academic DNA. And I'm just wondering about the canon, the art history canon in Canada, because that was briefly brought up. And I'm just wondering, where do we stand on that, on our identity, on our position, and how do we expect to produce critical work and critical writing when we don't really have a canon? So for me, it's a troubling question, this sense of identity, the Toronto identity. And I'm wondering if we could engage into a dialogue to discuss this issue.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting me a lot that I'm noticing about my own predilections these days is that I'm increasingly interested in the canon. I'm finding my attention drifting more towards Canadian art history. And in part, it's because I've been working on this project on Emily Carr, but also because I'm mindful of the fact that even a generation back, the work of artists that have come before today's artists is kind of lost in the snowstorm. And I'll go into a teaching situation and find that people aren't even necessarily conversant with figures like General Idea or Greg Curnow, and it's terrifying.
Yeah.
And I find this even more disturbing when I think about moving forward into an increasingly digital world where we're not sure how these records will be, how much the art of today will be recoverable in the future as digital formats change and so on. How do we preserve the history of the now? I think that one of the reasons that there is such a, has been historically at least, such a relatively feeble art market for contemporary art in Canada, that's now, as I say, starting to change, but it's because there wasn't a sense of contemporary practice being rooted in history, and rooted in a canon that is constantly being, refined and expanded and revised. And for people that are interested in the canon of Canadian art history, I want to refer you to the Arts Canada Institute website, where Sarah Angel and her team is in the process of creating this series of ebooks that retrieve figures, some of them very well-known, some of them more obscure, from Canadian art history and reinterpret them in this kind of multifaceted way, incorporating
primary research materials in many cases, so you can come to your own conclusion and access to work that either you'd never heard of or that you thought you knew all too well, like a figure that's very well known that needs to be revitalized. And I think that is an initiative that we really need to pursue vigorously in this generation, because we have to ground what's happening now in what has happened here before as a way of like laying claim to having a history. How do you take seriously the present if you don't take seriously the past?
Yeah. And of course, the elephant in the room there, literally, is has to do with institutions. I mean, that's where you get a canon from. You get a canon by having works on walls or in rooms that people can show up on a Wednesday evening and see again and again and again, so that they imprint as canonical.
Or maybe have those canonical works be reinterpreted by contemporary artists, so you get into a real conversation.
That's true.
About legacy.
But
that really excites me.
You know, you can travel most major cities of the world and find an institution that will give you a glimpse of the local art scene. And so you can spend an afternoon there and come away with a sense of, okay, now I know what contemporary artists have been busy doing in Rome for the past 30 years. Why? Because there's a place that devotes itself to that. We don't have that here.
Yeah.
And at least in Toronto. Yeah. And the Vancouver Art Gallery does a much better job in terms of putting out on view art that's been made locally. So does the museums in Montreal.
Oh, yeah.
Part of the problem is that Toronto's a media center. Media collects here, but there are institutional gaps, and that can affect the construction of a canon, because really all canon means is memory.
Yeah.
And we all know that that can change. We all know that there's all that art that R.M. Vaughan liked to write about. It's out there. It's not part of our memory until we choose to make it so, and decide whether it should. So
I would add one more thing too, that I think critics at their best are holding the work of the contemporary moment up to the court of history. And if we as the contemporary art world in general don't quite, that history is a bit of an empty room. I mean, it's not, of course, right? It's very much peopled, but not perhaps in the more strident sense that you would find in European countries or even the US. So I suppose if you're addressing potential rather than precedent, there's a really exciting opportunity there to carve out a position, to invent the identity rather than remodel it. I think as a contemporary art world, though, we need to embrace that opportunity, be less shy about making that first attempt at producing a position or a profile.
You're arguing for a canon, in a sense.
Yes.
Take that responsibility.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I think we're done.
I think maybe we are. That was really wonderful for me.